Welcome back to the Brave Bitches podcast. Hi, Kayla. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy to have you here, and I'm really excited for a conversation. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Okay, so for me, I am just getting to know you. I see you, the little bit I've gotten to know about you, I really enjoy, and I feel like we're going to have a great conversation. But for anyone that is like me, wants to get to know a little bit about who you are and what you're passionate about, could you just give me a little introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm Kayla. I'm from Oklahoma, so central Oklahoma. I live here we'll start with those. I live here with my four kids. I have four children, ages, I don't even know, 7, 10, 11, and 15, and my husband. And I homeschool my baby. So I do all of this stuff that we're going to be talking about. I do all of this in the chaos of having my kids home all the time. Which I think is really important to point out when we talk about kind of just tapping into this internal piece. It's not about your external environment, it's about the internal environment. And that leads right into what I do for work, right? So for work, I just help people access that inner peace that they already have, that's already there, and just kind of remove all the things that are in the way of them feeling that and experiencing that peace on an everyday basis.
I love that. Yes, experiencing. I love that you said it comes from internal and not external. I am actually, interestingly enough, so I'm one of 5 kids, but we were all homeschooled as well. So I definitely know the chaos of a big family when we're all trying to learn stuff and they're all different ages and no one's quite on the same page. So I'm curious for you, as someone, I know this is a side thing, but how did you first decide to homeschool? What was that desire for that?
Yeah, well, it was super interesting because I've never been good at school. It was nothing that I've avoided school like my whole life. I did anything I could to get out of classes like growing up, and I never thought I was smart. But when I had with my oldest daughter, she was going to school, and there was just a lot of like repeat things that I just wasn't happy with, like a lot of boundaries being crossed and it gets being like swept under the rug, like boys kissing her, boys touching her butt, and there was like nothing being done about it. And I was like, well, maybe it's just this school. We're moving, next year. Well, I'll just homeschool her for kindergarten year, and then I'll put her into school once we move. Well, so that was kind of like the idea there. I never saw myself as homeschooling, and we got into it and I loved it. I loved the way that we were able to stay connected. It didn't disrupt our day. I was present with all the kids, and I just loved that connection that we had. And so we just kept doing it. So she's the only person or only one of 4 that went to school, and she just went for a year, and all the rest of them have just been homeschooled.
Whoa, that's so cool. I love that. As an adult, as someone who was homeschooled from 4th grade until I graduated, I have amazing memories of being homeschooled. I loved it. I feel like there's so much freedom in that. And I think it contributes to how, where I am now, right? Where I'm working a job that I am my own boss. And I really love to read and I love to learn and all these things that I feel like I really contribute to the foundation of being homeschooled. So I just want to encourage you in that as a mama teaching your kids
Yes,
at home, like you're doing something good.
thank you so much. I love hearing that. You hear so many different, like almost horror stories sometimes of people who are homeschooled. And I'm like, we're not doing that. My kids are pretty free. They get to have their own brain and their own thoughts, and they get to create their own life, and do what they want within, of course, our 4 walls. But, we let them out, they get to go outside the house. So they get to experience it too.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think it's a different way of doing things, but there's so many strengths to it. And so yeah, and I feel like for you, you must be someone who also values freedom as well, because, well, obviously you're doing that with your kids and the way you're raising them to be more independent thinkers. You started this business, you're a coach, and you also have a podcast. And so you're basically your own boss as well. What was your journey to get to this point where you are now doing all this?
Yeah, it's really interesting. When I look back about in my life, I've never really had a super like traditional job where I had a boss. I had some like part-time jobs that were like seasonal. Like I was a lifeguard at a pool. I worked at a tax place where I was there. My mom worked there, so not really even, you know. So those are kind of like when I was growing up, those were like what I did. But outside of that, I just kind of knew I never wanted anyone to tell me what to do. Like I know that that's how I am. Like it just how I run,
Mm.
and I do value very much my autonomy and my sense of freedom. And I knew that I really wanted to be present with my children. And so that was like, how do I create that space? So I started off like in my early adult, like right after high school, I started, I went to real estate school and I started selling real estate. Well, I did that for a while. I got really, really sick.
Mm.
And so I had to stop because I couldn't drive. I couldn't do anything. I was sick for 2 years after I had my first daughter. And I got into this space of health where I was in a wheelchair. I was having multiple seizures a day. No one knew what was wrong with me. And what really was a turning point for me in that moment was I thought I would rather be dead than alive. Like, I just think it would be easier for everyone around me. I was such a burden. I was a burden to myself. And I was like, I'm just done. And I always make the joke that my husband wasn't completely bought into that theory. So we decided to do things different. He was like, it will not be easier without you here. So let's try something new. And that's what we did. So we went through a holistic path. So we kind of stepped out from what we were doing. But through that is also freedom is really shines bright here too, is that I realize that to have freedom, you have to be your own advocate. And if you're not advocating for yourself, then you're just trapped in somebody else's paradigm and belief system. And so that's what I really learned right then was that you have to advocate for yourself. Okay, so then I got better. I got out of the wheelchair and then I had more kids and life was going really well. And then I was searching for more financial freedom. Like, how can I bring myself financial freedom? And what would that look like? And how can I use my skills in a way in my story to help change other people's lives? And so I got into health coaching. That's how I got to where I'm at. I became a health coach. Well, what I realized was when you get into working with somebody's health, you're really working more, less on the health and more on the mind. So it's these attachments even that we have to being sick. So I had Lyme disease. And when you have Lyme disease, like a lot of people call themselves limeys. Like they're liming. And so what you're doing is you're attaching to your illness. And so then it becomes really hard to separate from that because who am I if I'm not being taken care of? Or who am I if I'm well? What am I going to do with my life if I can have a life? And so sometimes it becomes easier to stay stuck in these boxes that we put ourselves in with these labels. So what I noticed when we were with people who were really sick, they had a really hard time letting go of that label, whether they thought that they did or not. That was a real big root that they needed that identity in because they built their whole life around it. And so I was like, well, we can't just work with health. We have to work very deep in the emotional state. So I started to work within that. And that's what really kind of blew up where I'm at today is by noticing that and how that's intertwined in everything we do with our health, with our relationships, with our relationship to ourselves and others. If we don't break a lot of these paradigms and labels that we've created, we'll just keep spinning and spinning and spinning.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Oh my gosh, you said so many good things in that I want to like touch back on. One being the advocating for yourself and finding freedom in that, but also the identity as well. That's so, I think that as you were saying it, I was thinking that's such a coping mechanism for so many of us, right? Like it feels safe to have a title. It feels safe to say, this is me and this is how I live, and so we feel like it's better to stay that way. It's better for me to say, okay, I have this disease or I have this mental illness and stay in that zone because it's familiar. It's something that has like definitions online. It has a doctor that can tell you exactly what it is, right? And so there's like a sense of safety. But it's interesting because that same sense of safety that's providing, wellness for us in some ways is also the exact same thing that's going to keep you from breaking out of that, from healing, from growing. And yeah, so I love that you touched on that. I think that's huge. But before we dive into that, I really want you to dive more into the advocating thing, because I think that's something that so many of us can use that tool. So what did that look like for you when you say that, like, you had to learn how to advocate for yourself, and like, how can you encourage or tell people where to start with that in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting interesting thing that we don't talk a lot about, right? We think about advocating as almost like confrontation, right? It's confrontational. If you're advocating for yourself, you're like, you're kind of pushing back against somebody else, but that's not
You're like,
necessarily what I mean.
yeah.
Exactly. Engaging in conflict or a fight, right? But what we're doing is when I really think about advocating, I think about breaking through conditioning. And and I mean the conditioned response from ourselves, but our conditioned response from society. And I'll use the example of me being sick. So if I was advocating for myself, I had to break through the conditioned response of the paradigm of what health was and how to get healthy. So I was put in this box that I was always going to be sick. So if you have Lyme disease and you're always sick, you never get over it, right? If it's chronic, that's how it goes. So I was put in this box that I was always going to be this. So I had to advocate for myself and break through the paradigm and the condition that I was going to stay sick. And so when you advocate for yourself, you're really doing it from within. It's not necessarily without. Nobody needed to know that I was doing that. It wasn't a statement that I needed to make to anyone else. I had to make the statement to myself. I had to advocate for myself. Now, what that means is you do have to stand up for yourself, right? There will be conversations that you need to have outside of that, but you can't do that if you're not really strong in the understanding of why you're doing that. So I think when we advocate for ourselves, we have to do so with actually having a conversation with ourselves and saying, why am I acting this way? Why am I believing this? Why am I allowing this in my life and in my space? And why is it even the system that I'm operating out of? And then how do I smash that paradigm and advocate for a different experience?
Mm-hmm. I love that perspective. So, yeah, you're basically saying if you can change the perspective in you, right? And actually believe in yourself, believe that there is a different answer than what you've been given, then it makes so much sense that it's so much easier than when you go to a doctor or you go to, even a family member or someone that says, oh no, this is going to be forever, this is permanent. And you say, no, I actually genuinely believe that there are other things, that there is hope here, that there are solutions here. And that's something that you don't have to be rude about it. You don't have to fight like we were saying. But belief is powerful. And not only does it impact you, but it impacts those around you. Like people can tell when you believe what you're saying, when you believe that. And like, that's when I feel like that stuff starts coming to you, stuff starts falling in your lap, and, yeah, but that's huge. It's essentially advocating for yourself is really just shifting your perspective and your belief to really believe that there is hope or something else.
And the big thing that came up when you were talking about that, and it's not about getting, Aunt Jane to change her mind about it. That's what a lot of people think advocating is, that we try to change other people's mind. It's what you said, the key thing there, we have to change our mind about it. And that's all that matters. So if nobody else believes what I think, it doesn't matter because it's my belief and my experience. And I'm going to advocate for me to have that freedom in my belief and my experience. I don't need anyone else to believe it, or because it doesn't change my experience. So I think that's a beautiful way to kind of pull that together and
Totally.
really put a nice bow on it. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah, and then it's so funny. I mean, this is just a side thing, but then once that belief ends up manifesting and coming true, Aunt Jane's gonna be like, "Oh, I knew it all along," right? So it's really like it has to be about you and coming from you.
Exactly. Every time.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Okay, so I want to get back into the identity thing now. So, because I feel like every time you say something, it's like I got like five things that I'm like, yes, latch, latch, latch. Um, but yeah, identity. So I think it ties so well also with what we're saying with advocating for yourself, right? Like, how does identity tie in with that? And how has that been a key to your healing and your growth?
Yeah, so identity is such an interesting thing because we're pushed from very, very, very young to identify with something, with a group, with this, with that, with a belief, some type of structure. And I think, ultimately it's for survival, right? Like you identify with this,
Mm-hmm.
tribe or this, that, from our history of evolution. But when we look at it from today, we're identifying with a lot of things that are really causing us a lot of suffering. And so this is a really major concept. There's a lot of layers into this, but I think about it simply. Let me put this perspective out first, is when we identify with something, we deepen this me sense. And if we're always coming from this me sense, then we're coming from a place of suffering. So when we're always coming from this very deep sense of I,
Mm.
without this more, trying not to make it too woo woo and a little bit more to understand, without this central point, like the ego, we'll say that, right? The ego part of the
Yes.
self is what typically wants to latch onto the label versus more of the true sense of self that's pure and doesn't have any labels and is just in existence and being, right? That is just freedom. We don't have to be anything. Other people don't have to recognize certain things about us, and we don't have to show up in the world in a way where we're getting validation from anyone else because we're in our true sense of, our felt sense of just pureness. So the ego likes to grab onto things, right? I need this label because in this label, it feeds me in a certain way of being sick, right? I got a lot of attention that way. I got a lot of attention when I was sick. And so there's a lot of doting on me and being present with me. And that really fed a space within me that I needed to have because it brought a lot of attention, and it wasn't always positive attention, but it was attention. And so that sense of the ego wanted that. And so it's really hard to break those identities. And because if we don't have something to hold on to, then it's almost like, well, what are we holding on to? Right? Then what's left? If I don't have that, then what am I? And then we have to keep ourselves busy so we don't ask ourselves that deep question of who am I and what am I, and not try to give it a label answer. Because when you start to shed all of that
Mm.
external, you start to tap into that really deep inner peace because you're talking about your true self that doesn't actually have any labels or explanations to it. And that's really scary because the mind wants to be busy. The mind wants to
Mm.
create challenges. The mind's a miraculous thing. It needs something to do. So it's going to create something to do. And it's going to distract us from just this sense of calm and peace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how do you feel like, because I love what you're saying about, having an identity that doesn't have this label, that doesn't have this box you're putting yourself in, right? And like how that's the key to actually accessing our inner self and understanding ourselves. But like if you were trying to explain that to someone, like say they're 7 years old, or like one of your kids or something, how do you explain to them like a simple terms of, and maybe not seven, that's a bit young, but someone who's first trying to figure out who they are, maybe they're about teenage years, right? And it's like, how do you explain that to someone of how to find yourself without placing labels? Because I think that is the idea, right? Like, oh, who am I? Okay, I'm a girl. Um, I am like, this is my job, and I have a boyfriend, so I'm a girlfriend, and I have this, and like we have these labels, these identities, right? And so that's kind of how we say who I am. Like, how do you explain that in a more simple terms of being able to do that without those boxes, if that makes sense?
That's a beautiful thing. Yeah. So I'll just explain how I explain it to my children. Right. And so it is when we
Perfect.
have, yeah, so we have like external labels, right? So we will have those. Those will never go away, right? So like I am a mom, I'm a business owner, I can go down a whole list of I'm a wife, I'm all these things in the external sense of a label. But there's an understanding that I'm not those things. Right? That's not actually my identity. That is just something that I use to operate in the world because we have to, because in the relative sense of the relative world, we have to operate with a separate identity that kind of separates us. But to the true self, that's not who I am. I'm not mom. I'm not this. Right. And even those labels and those external identities that we, just get attached to us, they can still be here because there's a presentation of it. I have to show up as a speaker. I have to show up as an author. I have to show up as this. Those are just the presentation of how this deep sense
Mm-hmm.
is relating to the world. How do we relate to the world is really a better sense of how I explain to my kids. How can you relate to this experience? And the reason why I help with my children to break down those labels is because sometimes those labels will go away. And so, for example, if you identify so strongly as being a girlfriend, if that relationship's ends, your identity ends. That identity ends instead of it just being a role
Mm-hmm.
that you were showing up in that moment, right? So we play all these different roles and
Mm-hmm.
characters. I like to call them avatars. So I say we're all these different avatars, different characters in different spaces of our life, and sometimes that role goes away for a while, or gets put on the back burner. And but when we put all of our identity and we think, this is myself, I am a good girlfriend, or I am a good business owner, and some reason that falls apart for whatever, now our identity falls apart with it, instead of just realizing, oh no, my true self is not attached to any of that, right? It's still here. I'm still at peace. Now, what's my other relationship to the external
Mhm.
world that I step into? Does that help break it down a little bit more?
Yeah, totally. I love that. It's yeah, it's essentially like what you would hear in Buddhism too, right? That separation, that unattachment, right? So allowing and identifying those roles in our life and the way that we show up and how we, how people can understand us, right? Is to say, okay, I am this, I am that, I am this and that. But saying essentially my true self, who I am, Hannah, I am not all of those things, right? Which is so much easier said than done, right? Because it's so easy to say, okay, yeah, I'm a wife, but also like I'm separated from a wife. But if my marriage were to end, there would still be a lot of grief, right? That comes with separating from that role and that identity. And so I think that like the goal maybe is to create a separation there. And so I don't completely lose myself, but still understanding that like we live in a world where there has to be some sort of attachment to these things and giving grace for that, right? And giving some like leeway there when there is that pain, right? So like say you're a student and you really try to have good grades. And yes, that's not you, but like if you get a D on a essay, that's gonna, you're gonna feel some grief there, right? So yeah, I think it's an interesting balance of identifying that we're separate, but also giving us some space to realize we're still human.
Right. And we just call it a game around our house. I'm like, you're playing the game, right? You're playing the game of reality. And so sometimes that game changes, and sometimes your avatar, your character in that game is going to change as well. But when we keep sticking all these different identities and these labels to us, it becomes really hard because we don't actually know what we need to let go of and what's true and what's not. Because at some state, you may be the best student, but then all of a sudden something changes and now your grades aren't as well, but you only
Mhm.
identified with someone who got A's. And for some reason, maybe you had a head injury and now that's not present anymore. And so now it's a really big struggle. And so now
Mhm.
it's like everything you ever thought about yourself is going away. And so it's really is that separation. And there, like you said, there can be that grieving process of like, oh, if this goes away, but this is where it gets really challenging. This is where a lot of people push back. It's like, I am a wife, but if that, and I've been with my husband since I was 15. So he like makes up a big part of my life. I've been with him for more than half my life at this point. And so that makes up a big point. But if something was to have happened to our marriage, or does happen to our marriage, ultimately, no, I know I'm okay. Because my identity isn't attached to our relationship. Now it's a big part of my experience and the
Yeah.
game I play in reality. But ultimately, to my deepest sense of self, nothing actually changes there. And so it's really always grounding and anchoring yourself back into that really helps us actually navigate this,
Mhm.
because then when somebody says, oh, you suck at what you do, you're like, oh, that's such an interesting thing for you to think, because it doesn't really matter because you're not attached to being really good at it.
Totally. Yeah. Okay, I feel like this is perfectly segueing into why I initially reached out to you in the first place, which is radical responsibility, because that was something you said you feel very passionate about. And I feel like with this identity thing, right, when you separate yourself from a role like, say, wife or say, student or something, that's where I feel like you're then able to make choices that are not dictated by holding on to that, right? So, like, say the marriage turns really unhealthy and there's, something that's not a good space for either of you anymore, right? To if you're not fully identifying as wife, it allows you to say, okay, me and my true self, this is not a safe space for us anymore. I need to take responsibility for myself and make a choice to break outside of that and separate yourself, right? And so I think we can create a lot more safety for ourselves when we are separating ourselves from these specific roles so that we don't bend over backwards to make sure we keep these specific things that we are like, this is me type of thing, right? And so for you, like you've talked about radical responsibility and how that's such a key piece in what you teach. So like how do you like, can you explain and dive into that a little bit and what that looks like for you and how that's been a tool in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about radical responsibility, it makes me so excited because it's like when you realize that you are radically responsible for everything that happens in your life, some people think, I actually don't want that. But it is the most freeing thing you could possibly understand and grasp for yourself because nobody else freaking holds your chains anymore. Right? Nobody else is in control of your happiness when you are radically responsible for your life. And the only thing you can change is your perception and your experience and your action from within. So when you fully take radical responsibility and you're not waiting for somebody else to change so your life changes, so you're happier, so all of these different things happen to you, then you can actually step into pure freedom and joy and peace because you're radically responsible for your internal state. And that's everything. That's we are responsible for our reality, right? We see our reality based off of our own point of view and from our experience and from our conditioning and from our upbringing and all those things. So we're radically responsible for what happens within that reality.
Yeah, I feel like for me, radical responsibility is something that resonates with me because I agree, it's given me so much freedom because I don't place power in those around me to impact, my emotions and who I am and the choices I'm making. And not saying that there's not moments, right? But like identifying that is a key value in my life is taking responsibility for the choices I make. And to get to the place that I am, to feel that I had to go through a period of like, I left religion and stepped into, complete unknown when I was in my early 20s, where I lost my community, I lost my identity, I lost basically everything that I had built to be who I was, right? And then I spent years angry, resentful, blaming everybody else for why I felt angry, why I had to leave, why yada, 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 right? And it wasn't until like I reached this point where I was so sick and tired of being angry all the time and feeling this like, just this fire come out for little tiny things, right? And realizing it was because I was blaming everybody else in my life for the way that my life looked. And so I had to reach that breaking point to realize that like I needed to take responsibility for my choices and I needed to decide the type of life I wanted to live and not dictate it off of how everybody else was choosing to act around me and to me and towards me and all these things. So I'm curious for you, like, I know you must have gone through something in your life or some sort of pivotal moment that made you realize you need to take responsibility. And what did that look like for you? And give me a little of your story.
Yeah, so I don't know if I can just pinpoint like one exact thing, right? I think it's such a compilation of all
Mm-hmm.
the external experiences. But what I've known from a really young state actually is that when people would say nobody can make you mad, right? Nobody makes you mad. Like it's like in society we know
Mm-hmm.
that like
Mm-hmm.
nobody makes you mad, and it's like but you make me mad, but then we don't practice what we preach type of deal, right? Well, I actually remember
Totally.
quite.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, if this person doesn't make me mad, or if they don't make you mad, then I'm looking at adults in my life, then why are you so mad? Right? Then why are you guys so mad all the time? Like, if it doesn't work
For
like
real.
that, yeah, then why is I could these two things aren't matching up? But I actually like looked at that like and I didn't really understand it until I didn't have an answer until I got into my adulthood. And then I started to be able to separate myself from it instead of like the reaction. I was like, oh, well, nobody makes me mad. Anger is generated within me. And anger is generated within me because of my conditioning and from my experience. And you just triggered something, a need within me that wasn't met. And so now I lash out. And now it's your fault because you made me mad. And then I started to realize, well, it's actually this could be a brick wall in front of me. It doesn't matter if I was to have generated that whole cycle. That's the anger was here. Right. So that's what I really started to realize was that everything's generated within us, just like in me, everything in my life is generated within me, and everything in your life is generated within you. And it has nothing to do with the other, except for you may be a mirror to what's now being generated within me. And so for me, when I really started about that personal responsibility, I can think about some really major things in my life when I was really reactive. I was a yeller, like just always yelling at my kids, always thinking that they were the ones that, if they were just would just mind, right? Or they would just be quiet, right? If they would just do that, I could finally be at peace. And I was like, this doesn't have anything to do with them. This has to do with my reaction to whatever disruption is happening in the external world. So I have to be if I want my life to be calm, I actually have to step into calm. I have to be responsible for what's coming up within me and what that story means about me. So why my kids went through a poop phase, and I won't call them out by names, but like there were some kids that I have that went through a poop phase where they played with their poop. And it used to make me so mad. Like it would make me so angry. And I was just like, why is this my life? Why is everything I do, why is it nonstop that things keep happening like this? And then I thought, maybe it's my relationship to what's happening. Maybe it's because I think that my kids, who were way too young to be manipulating, maybe I'm making it out for them to be something that they're doing to me. And when I started to realize that my entire reality was now being built upon me thinking that somebody else is doing something, let's say, to hurt me or to inconvenience me, and I took personal responsibility and said, I'm inconveniencing myself by creating the story attached to the external world. And so my kids were really huge with helping me get to my own personal responsibility by not reacting and not taking things personal of what they were doing or were not doing. And so that was a big part of my evolution of that understanding that this isn't about me. What they're doing isn't about me. That's whatever they're doing. But what is about me is my relationship and my thought process and my beliefs around what they're doing. That's what I can control, and that's what I can shift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my mom always said that kids are refiners, and so she had lots of kids because she needed lots of refining.
Yeah, that's so great.
And I totally see that. I mean, even just being in relationship with others is refining, right? It's always you're constantly getting confronted with your triggers and your like childhood wounds and your thoughts around what this means and what that means, right? Like, and those are adult relationships where like they have, hopefully, if you're around healthy people, have a little bit more management on being able to understand themselves and their emotions and how they communicate, right? And so kids, I mean, I was a nanny for years, which I know is so different than being a mom, but even kids, like they're learning how to human from scratch, right? Like they don't know how to human. And so of course I feel like that's got to be the most triggering thing, is to just be around, you're getting confronted with all your stuff all the time with these tiny little humans, and they're not doing it on purpose, but it's still there, it still exists, right? And so I love to hear that as someone who wants to be a mom one day. Like I love to hear you talking about motherhood and how you found ways to be the best mom that you can be, and also while still like it's allowing it to be like a growth tool for you, becoming a mom, like something that is good for both you and your kids that you love on. Yeah, I think that's huge and amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that I had to come to terms with too was that we place these ideas and expectations on children or others, like our spouse or our friends and things like that. We expect them to be these humans that we want them to be, and they're just simply not. Like it's just an idea that we create, and then nobody can match up to that. And so when we drop those expectations of others, things really start to shift. Now, that does not mean that you can let people cross your boundaries and things like that. You have to be very strong and secure. That's what you're personally responsible for, of what kind of what you want your reality to look like, basically. But knowing and not placing this unrealistic expectation on people, because I loved what you said when you said they're trying to human, but my brain automatically said, well, maybe they actually know how to be human, and us as adults have messed that up with all of our rules and conditioning, right? So maybe they're at the most authentic form because,
Honestly,
hey,
yes.
they're the closest to creation than we are, right? We're now messed up with our own brains and expectations and everything else that we do. And so it's like, that's what we have to, like, why? It's always questioning everything. It's questioning those paradigms like we talked about earlier, full circle back to that. It's questioning and advocating for yourself. Why do I believe what I believe? Why do I think my child needs to act like this? Why do I think my husband needs to, do this to show his love? Why do I think this has to be that way? And then advocating for your actual beliefs and what actually fits your life, and not just what somebody else expects you to be doing or experiencing.
Yeah, I love that. Like, Okay, so the expectations versus like how would you explain to someone that you can lower your expectations but you still need to hold your boundaries and keep yourself safe, like how do you hold both of those two things at the same time when they sound like they're kind of counterintuitive to each other, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so one thing is that like when you hold somebody to an expectation, and we'll use like a spouse, like you expect your spouse to do something for you to elicit happiness within you, it's never going to work, right? Because they don't hold the key to your
Mm,
happiness. Right? And so when we expect someone to act a certain way, for us to be happy, we've given power to something to somebody who doesn't hold it. Okay. So we have to realize that nothing they do is actually going to make us happy. We just generate happiness at the result of them doing something. And so one, it's this very fine line of understanding that for itself, right? Happiness is generated within in us. And so how can we keep doing that? Well, we expect our spouse to do something so I can generate my happiness. Okay, so when we put that power into their hands, we've created a disconnect from ourselves. Now, with that being said, we do have this circle relationship, right? Where like you give to the other and the other gives back to you. And we do that. And those are kind of things that we give and receive and we give and receive and we give and receive. But ultimately, we recognize that the receiving part of that is not necessary for our happiness and our peace. And that's what's really important here to start with. Because if we keep thinking somebody else owns it, then we're really going to be disrupted. It's really going to pull us away from where we want to be focusing. Okay, so now that's just like on simple terms. Now let's go to more like boundaries when somebody is very disrespectful or if somebody is crossing what you think are your boundaries. That's when you have to advocate for yourself and you say, this isn't the situation I want to be in. I'm not expecting you to make me happy, but what's happening is the mirror that's coming in within me is resentment or hate or uncomfortable or all of those other things that you don't, or sadness, right? I don't expect you to change, right? Because you've proven to me that's who you are. So I'm going to have to change my relationship to you. And that's that difference. It's that fine line. And we keep saying, well, if you'll just change this, then I'll be happy. Well, then that doesn't happen. And then that doesn't happen. And that doesn't happen. Well, I'm unhappy, right? So do I need to change my relationship either to that expectation? Because maybe it's an unrealistic expectation, which happens a lot, right? Or maybe I think that what I'm asking them to do is actually rooted in something different. And or am I really actually unsafe? And what's generating within me is unhappiness, and I
mm,
do need to leave. And so, what you're doing is you're not looking at the other person, you're looking at yourself. And that's how you know how to set the boundaries and how to shift the
mm.
boundaries. Is when we remove the external and we say, what's actually happening within me? And then you can ask yourself, am I not being authentic to myself? Am I dropping my integrity or my values to shift into this mold? And so when we keep bringing this conversation back to self, then we can actually really advocate for ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because both of them come back to who we are and how we are viewing and responding to the world, right? So like using that marriage example too, right? It's like an expectation might be I expect that we don't yell while we're arguing, right? And so that's if you're just having this expectation though, and then yelling starts to happen, and you just are like, okay, now you're devastated, now you're angry, now you're mad, and you're taking all these things, right? But like you're not taking responsibility like we were talking about for your own self, right? So if then that's when it switches, I think, into boundaries, right? It's like, okay, my boundary is going to be we're not going to yell while we're arguing. But what that means is that if arguing begins, I'm going to step outside the room. I mean, if yelling begins, I'm going to step outside the room, or I'm going to separate myself from this situation. And it's, again, it's not saying you need to change. I expect you to not yell anymore in our relationship, or I expect you not to do this. It's saying, like, for my own self, like, I have to protect myself. If there is yelling in an argument, I will separate myself. And like, that, and I feel like that's such a key thing there is that both are coming back to us and how we are perceiving the world and how we can relate. And I feel like in a marriage, like that's the most difficult thing, I think, is like in most of my relationships in my life, I feel that it's easy to be able to, set my boundaries or like not really have these unrealistic expectations. But I feel like in a marriage where there's so much more interactions, there's so much more intimacy, there's so much more leaning on each other than most relationships, that like you really got to be checking yourself. Like, where are my expectations? Where am I like setting these standards for someone that are unrealistic, or where am I not placing boundaries where I need to place boundaries? And so as someone who, you said you've been married for like, or at least you've been with your partner for most, or like over half of your life now at this point, like what is a tool that you use for yourself when you do start to feel like you're getting kind of lost in that like mindset and getting maybe stuck in those situations where you are placing those expectations?
Yeah, such a great. Okay, so I'm 34. Been with my husband since I was 15, and we've been married for 15 years. We've been together for almost 20 and married for 15 years.
Wow.
So almost 16.
So you were high school
actually.
sweethearts?
Yeah, we're high school sweethearts. So we've grown up together, right? So we've evolved over
So
these
cute.
things, and we've evolved through our expectations and also the different personalities that we, of course, move through, right? The different characters we play in life. And so for me, when I really think about this, I think about this conversation that has to be had with like we were talking about, like the expectation part of it, of I expect you to do this. But one big thing I want to get into first is actually understanding what something means to somebody else. And this is important in any relationship that you're in. And I want to use the yelling example, because what happens is yelling to me could mean something else than yelling to my husband. And so if you're not clear on what that means, and if you think that he's yelling at you to belittle you or to do this or to do that, or it may just be like a natural crescendo, because women have this too, of their voice when they're excited. And it actually has nothing to do with you. And it doesn't mean they're extremely angry at you, but it's just the adrenaline that happens by the intense conversation. That's really important to know, because what can happen is yelling can happen, and then we think we create a story about it, and then we say that's not okay. So this is where questioning everything is really important. Is why do I not think yelling's okay? Well, I don't think yelling's okay because I felt like crap when I got yelled at, right? That's what that is. So I can acknowledge that my husband's not actually trying to make me feel like crap. It is an experience and a representation of how he's feeling that then triggers me, that then brings something up within me that I have to deal with. Now, that does not mean don't have the conversation with your husband about it, right? And explain why you feel so triggered. But it's this a really open dialogue and conversation about, what does yelling mean to you? Because yelling means this to me, right? And that's what you're really focused on. But we always focus on like these random things, like, husband doesn't take out the trash. Well, that means they don't respect me. It's like, that just means I didn't take out the trash. Like, but we attach so many different things to that. And so it's always being like, what does it mean to you when this happens? Because this is what the story that gets brought up in my mind when it happens. And so I think when we have a lot of open dialogue and conversation, not about, hey, I need you to take out the trash. It's, it makes me feel very disrespected if you don't take out the trash after I asked. What does that mean to you? Well, it makes me feel like you're mothering me when you ask me to take out the trash. So we're having two different conversations, and we're two people's, Eckhart Tolle calls it your pain body, right? So two people's pain bodies are being triggered, and whose pain body is more important? That's a really good question to ask. Well, whose pain body is more important here? Is it your need to yell, or my need not to be yelled at? Or is it my need for the trash to be taken out, or your need not to be told to take the trash out? So when you really look at it like that, that's what real compromise is. It's the awareness of the other person's, we'll use Eckhart's words, pain body being triggered. And so then you can actually understand what these things mean to you. And it's not about the trash. It's not about the yelling. It's not about, whatever the plans that you had that somebody forgot about or whatever. It's about what it triggers within you, and then exploring that. And that open dialogue is what actually creates the shift in the experience. And that's why we come right back to that personal responsibility. This is personal responsibility. You are personally responsible, radical responsibility for what comes up within you. And that's what we're referencing.
Totally. Yeah. I love that. Acknowledging that both are coming from a perspective where they feel this is, it's still true for them, right? This is a true feeling for you, right? Like I love the example of the trash, right? Like for your husband or my husband, it might be like, oh yeah, this feels true for me, that when you mother me, it's like this is not a good dynamic between the two of us, and it doesn't feel good for me, right? And it doesn't feel good for me when I ask you to take out the trash and you don't, right? And so I think that's kind of the fun part of arguing, if this makes sense, when we can both get to that point where we've acknowledged what feels uncomfy for us and what hurts and where we're at. It's like, okay, cool. Now we can get to be a little creative here. Now we get to come up with what works for us, right? So maybe like a solution looks like, okay, so I won't ask for the trash, but how are you going to handle this? And maybe he says, okay, I look and see if the trash needs to be emptied every single night before I go to bed, right? And so then I don't have to worry about asking you. You don't have to worry about feeling mothered by me. And so then there's like some sort of solution there. And I feel like I love that point. Like my husband and I have figured that out, and we have so much fun with it, realizing that like our relationship doesn't have to look like everybody else's. It doesn't have to have this certain formula, right? But if it works for both of us, then it's a solution, right? Like for example, we had so many arguments at the beginning of our relationship about who's going to do all the house chores, right? Like who's going to clean the bathroom, who's going to vacuum, who's going to, do the dishes, who's going to cook, right? We had like all these things that like every time I'd be nagging at him and he would be mad about this, right? And now we've come to a solution for us, which means that I do most of the cleaning, except for he does laundry and he does dishes. And for me, those are my two least favorite chores. And so I'm like, this is a win for me. I'll scrub the toilet all day if I don't have to do the laundry, and I don't have to do the dishes ever, right? And so that for me, it's like I feel like that's the fun and beauty of a relationship, is when you can have a little fun with the solution making, and instead of it being like you're wrong or I'm wrong, it's like us together fighting one problem and coming up with creative solutions together. And so that's where it gets good, you know?
Exactly. And one more thing on that too, to really kind of bring home another point we talked about, which was the labeling aspect. And so what happens a lot of times, we'll keep going with the trash can, right? So what happens is like trash can's not taken out. He doesn't listen to me. He doesn't respect me. He doesn't this. So you've just attached to that identity of not being heard or not being valued. And so when you're attaching to that, you're seeing everything in your external world to prove it. Versus if you walk by and the trash needs to be taken out and you don't make any meaning behind it, it's just the trash needs to be taken out and you saw it and you just pick up the trash and you just take the trash out, then there's no meaning behind it. There's no label. There's no, they disrespect me, or, oh, I have to do this, or, oh, I have to do everything. The trash just gets taken out. Right. And so those are different aspects of what happens when we are always attaching our identity to action or what's happening in our external world. And that's why it's really important to recognize, what am I saying this means? What do I mean by this? Why? Right.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it really does come all back to, excuse me, what we were talking about earlier with that attaching ourselves to those identities and attaching ourselves to these things. And it's the key really. I mean, obviously our theme of this entire thing is like coming back to ourselves, right? And taking that responsibility and identifying our own needs, wants, expectations, all of these things. So then we can say, okay, this is me, this is coming from me, and this is not you. And if I can take responsibility for that, then I can step forward. Then I can advocate for myself. Then I can do all these things that we've been talking about, right? And that's huge. I love it. It's some good stuff. We've had some good conversation. So good. So good. Well, I've had so much fun chatting with you today, and like I feel like you opened my mind in a lot of ways, and like we really got to explore some interesting topics. But before I let you go today, do you mind if I just head into our rapid fire questions to kind of wrap up our time together?
Love it.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So first question I have for you, really deep, important question is, what superpower, if you could pick a superpower, which one would you choose?
Oh my gosh. Flying. I think it would just have to be flying.
Totally. You want to be like a bird? Would you want wings or just like Superman style?
Just Superman style. I just like to be able to go from here to there and not have to drive. Like my oldest is about to be 16, and I'm like, okay, my husband can drive me around all the time and you can drive me around all the time and I don't have to drive again. And so But if I also could have a superpower to fly, then I wouldn't have to ever drive. So,
Okay, that's valid. That's valid. No more driving, just flying. That's fantastic. Okay, next question is what is a comfort meal for you?
man, that's not a very nice question to ask because I'm on the carnivore diet. Let's say
No.
mashed potatoes are probably hands down my comfort. That's a whole meal. That's a whole meal for me is mashed potatoes.
That's awesome. I love it. I love potatoes. I live in Peru right now and they love their potatoes. And let me tell you, I have never been so happy. Like I eat potatoes with every meal and it's like a 10 out of
That's amazing.
10. Okay. Next question I have is what are, and this is kind of like a tough one I'm throwing at you real quick. So maybe hopefully you can think of stuff, but are there three books, movies, or podcasts that you would recommend to listeners, maybe based on what you do or just that have been really amazing tools for you that you could recommend to listeners?
Yeah, I would say three big places that would be really great is Eckhart Tolle. Really diving into his work. The Power Up Now is a great place. It's a really good place to start to kind of understand this. Michael Singer's The Untethered Soul is also a really good one as well. Michael
Mm.
Singer's Untethered Soul is probably a really good beginner place to start, honestly. And then anything by Adia Shante is a really good thing as well. So those books I think are really wonderful. Those would be my three places for you to go.
Okay, cool. And I will put that in the show notes as well. So anybody that wants to check those out, they can. And then the last question I have for you is why do you feel it's important to be brave?
Well, I think that if you're not showing up authentically and you're not stepping into that level of bravery, then you're not experiencing life. And I think that the biggest thing we want to do is experience life in a level of freedom. And if you're not brave enough to question, then you're not going to have that freedom that I absolutely know you're looking for.
Yeah, so good. I love that answer. I love it. Well, this has been so great having you on here. Thank you so much for letting me dive into your mind a little bit, Kayla, and just being open and sharing your story a little bit. I'm sure tons of people that are listening are curious where to find you. So if there's anything you'd like to share, this is your time to how people can connect with you and what you do.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, of course, you can find me on Instagram. It's just Kayla Burch, Burch. And also my website, kaylabirchcoaching.com. There's lots of different offerings on there. I have a lot of different free offerings that walk you through my method that I have. It's called the trigger response method. Also some different concepts to dive deeper into this radical responsibility, radical truth telling, all these different aspects to yourself you can find on my website. And then I do have a podcast as well, The Emotional Revolution. So we dive deep into this also. And if you're interested in doing what I do, I actually coach and train coaches to become transformational coaches. So I have a coaching certification as well. So there's lots of different things that you can do to get into my space and work with me. So those are just some of my current offerings I have right now.
Awesome. That's so good. And I, again, will link that stuff in the show notes for anybody that wants to find you, Kayla, and connect with you. But again, thank you so much. I really appreciate this conversation and I wish you all the greatness in life.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening and watching this episode of the Brave Bitches podcast. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, share, review, all that good stuff. Also follow me on Instagram at Hannah Soul Marie or at Brave Bitches Without the I for some behind the scenes look and clips from the episode. Again, thank you for listening and I'll see you next time.